The year is 1347. You've been walking for 3 days through the English countryside, your feet bleeding through holes in your worn leather boots. The Black Death has swept through your village, taking your family, your neighbors, everyone you've ever known. You carry nothing but a few copper coins sewn into your tunic and the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lies sanctuary. As twilight falls, you see it in the distance. A low stone building with smoke curling from its chimney and the warm glow of firelight spilling from its windows. The wooden sign hanging above the door creaks in the evening wind, bearing the faded image of a boar's head. This is it. This is what you've been searching for. A medieval tavern. But what you're about to experience inside bears little resemblance to the cozy, romantic image most people have of medieval taverns today. The reality was far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more essential to survival than any fairy tale would suggest. Tonight, we're going to step through that heavy wooden door and discover what really happened inside medieval taverns. We'll meet the desperate souls who gathered there, witness the brutal economics of survival, and uncover the shocking truth about how these establishments actually functioned during some of history's darkest periods. As you draw closer to the tavern, the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's a smell. Even from 50 yards away, you can detect the pungent mixture of unwashed bodies, fermented grain, animal waste, and something else you can't quite identify, but makes your stomach turn. This is the smell of medieval life, concentrated into one building, where dozens of people have gathered with nowhere else to go. The building itself is smaller than you might expect. Most medieval taverns were simple affairs. A main room with a few tables, a kitchen area, and if you were lucky, a few cramped rooms upstairs for sleeping. The walls are thick stone on the bottom, timber and daub on top, built to withstand both the elements and the occasional brawl. The windows are small, covered with oiled cloth rather than glass, which was far too expensive for most establishments. Outside the door, you notice a wooden post driven into the ground. This is the ale stake, a legal requirement that signals this establishment is licensed to sell alcohol. Without it, the tavern keeper could face heavy fines or even imprisonment. But this simple post represents something far more important. It means this place has been officially recognized as a refuge, a place where the normal rules of medieval society are temporarily suspended. As you approach the door, you hear the sounds from within. Voices talking in low, urgent tones. The scrape of wooden bowls against tables. The crackle of the fire. And underneath it all, a constant low murmur. The sound of people sharing stories, making deals, and simply trying to survive another day. You notice other travelers arriving as you do. A woman in a torn woolen dress. Her children clinging to her skirts. An old man leaning heavily on a walking stick. His eyes clouded with cataracts. A young merchant with a carefully guarded pack on his back, his hand never leaving the knife at his belt. All of you are here for the same reason. You have nowhere else to go. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was a lifeline. In a world where most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace, taverns were the crucial connection points that held society together. They were where news traveled, where business was conducted, where the homeless found shelter, and where the desperate made their last stand against starvation and death. But they were also places where fortunes were lost, where innocent travelers were robbed, where diseases spread like wildfire, and where violence erupted without warning. The tavern was simultaneously heaven and hell, and you were about to discover which one you'd find tonight. You push open the heavy wooden door, and the assault on your senses is immediate and overwhelming. The heat hits you first. A stifling wall of warmth generated by dozens of bodies crowded into a space no larger than a modern living room. The smoke from the central fire pit burns your eyes, mixing with the fumes from countless oil lamps and tallow candles that provide the only light in this dim, shadowy world. The noise is cacophonous. Conversations in at least 3 different languages overlap, with the sounds of dice clattering against wooden tables, the slosh of ale being poured from clay jugs, and the constant scrape of benches against the hard-packed dirt floor. Someone in the corner is playing a crude wooden flute, its thin notes barely audible above the din. But it's the smell that truly overwhelms you. The sweet, sour scent of fermenting grain mingles with the acrid smoke from the fire. Unwashed bodies press close together, creating a funk that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils. The rushes on the floor, meant to absorb spills and provide insulation, haven't been changed in weeks. They're soaked with spilled ale, urine, vomit, and God knows what else. The whole place reeks of desperation and survival. Your eyes slowly adjust to the dim light, and you begin to make out the details of your surroundings. The tavern is built around a central hearth where a fire burns constantly, tended by a young boy who can't be more than 10 years old. The smoke is supposed to escape through a hole in the roof, but much of it hangs in the air, creating a permanent haze that makes everything look dreamlike and unreal. The furniture is rough and practical. Long wooden tables with benches that can seat 12 people each. No chairs. Those are a luxury that won't become common for another few centuries. The tables are scarred with knife cuts, stained with countless spills, and bear the carved initials of travelers who passed through and wanted to leave some mark of their existence. Behind the tables, you notice something that would shock most modern visitors. There are no individual rooms visible from the main hall. Privacy is a concept that doesn't exist for common folk in medieval times. If you're lucky enough to afford a bed for the night, you'll be sharing it with strangers. If you can't afford that luxury, you'll be sleeping on the floor with dozens of others, using your pack as a pillow and praying no one steals your belongings while you sleep. The walls are lined with wooden barrels of various sizes, some for ale, others for wine, and a few for the more exotic spirits that enterprising tavern keepers might have acquired through trade. Hanging from the rafters are bundles of dried herbs, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, and strings of onions and garlic. This isn't just decoration, it's the tavern's food supply, stored in the only place where it might be safe from rats and thieves. As you stand in the doorway, still processing this assault on your senses, you realize that every eye in the room has turned toward you. In medieval times, strangers were both an opportunity and a threat. You might be carrying news from distant lands, or you might be carrying the plague. You might have money to spend, or you might be a spy for a rival lord. In a world where information traveled at the speed of a walking horse, newcomers were always scrutinized with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A large woman with arms like tree trunks approaches you. This is the tavern keeper's wife, and she's examining you with the practiced eye of someone who's seen thousands of travelers pass through these doors. She's calculating your worth, assessing your threat level, and deciding whether you're more likely to pay your bills or cause trouble. Her decision will determine whether you're welcomed or thrown back out into the cold night. You'll be wanting ale and a place by the fire, she says, not really asking. It's not a question because there are no other options. Water is dangerous to drink. It's often contaminated with waste and disease. Milk spoils quickly, without refrigeration. Tea and coffee won't reach Europe for centuries. Ale is the safest beverage available, and even children drink it with every meal. You nod and produce one of your precious copper coins. The woman's demeanor shifts slightly. You're not a beggar. At least not yet. She gestures toward a space at one of the long tables, and you make your way through the crowd, trying not to step on the people already sitting on the floor. As you squeeze onto the bench, you find yourself pressed between a grizzled old soldier with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, and a young woman who might be pretty under the layer of dirt and exhaustion that coats her face. This is your first lesson in tavern etiquette. Personal space doesn't exist. Everyone shares everything, from benches to bowls to beds. The tavern keeper's wife returns with a clay mug filled with a dark, foamy liquid. This is your ale, and it's nothing like any beer you might have tasted in the modern world. It's thick and soupy, with bits of grain floating in it. The alcohol content is low, usually around 2 to 3%, but it's enough to kill most of the harmful bacteria that would otherwise make you sick. It tastes sour and slightly sweet, with an underlying bitterness that comes from the fact that hops haven't been widely adopted yet. Most ale is flavored with whatever herbs and spices the brewer had available. You take a tentative sip and try not to grimace. This is your dinner, your medicine, and your primary source of hydration all rolled into one. In medieval times, the average person consumed between 1 and 2 gallons of ale per day. Not because they were all drunkards, but because it was literally the only safe thing to drink. As you nurse your ale, you begin to observe the other patrons more closely. The medieval tavern was a microcosm of society, bringing together people who would never normally interact. At the table next to you, a well-dressed merchant is deep in conversation with a Benedictine monk. Across the room, a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury are sharing stories with a travelling minstrel. In the corner, a young couple sits, huddled together, whispering urgently about something that clearly has them worried. But not everyone here is a willing customer. In the far corner, you notice a group of rough-looking men who seem to be watching the other patrons with predatory interest. These are the wolves among the sheep, the ones who prey on travellers who've had too much to drink or who flash their money too carelessly. The tavern keeper tolerates them because they're paying customers, but she keeps a close eye on them, ready to intervene if things get out of hand. Near the fire, an old woman sits alone, nursing a single mug of ale that she's been sipping for hours. She's one of the tavern's regulars, probably a local widow who has nowhere else to go. The tavern keeper lets her stay because she pays what she can and causes no trouble. In return, she helps with small tasks, cleaning mugs, tending the fire, keeping an eye on things when the proprietors are busy. You notice that despite the crowd, there's a strange rhythm to the tavern's activity. People come and go at all hours, but there are natural peaks and valleys in the chaos. The busiest times are just after sunset, when travelers seek shelter for the night, and just before dawn, when those who can afford to continue their journeys prepare to leave. The medieval tavern operated on a different schedule than the modern world. There were no clocks, no standardized time zones, no concept of business hours. The tavern was open whenever there were customers, which was essentially always. The tavern keeper and their family lived on the premises, and their lives revolved entirely around the needs of their patrons. As the evening progresses, you begin to understand that the tavern serves functions that go far beyond simply providing food and drink. This is where news is exchanged, where business deals are made, where marriages are arranged, and where the complex social networks that held medieval society together were maintained and strengthened. The merchant at the next table is negotiating the sale of a cartload of wool to a cloth dealer from the next town over. They're discussing prices, quality, delivery dates, and payment terms. But they're also sharing information about road conditions, bandit activity, and political developments that might affect their business. This informal network of traveling merchants was one of the primary ways information spread across medieval Europe. The monk is listening to confessions from several of the patrons, offering spiritual guidance and, more importantly, news from the monastery where he's based. Monasteries were centers of learning and communication, and monks were often the most educated people most common folk would ever encounter. A traveling monk might carry letters between monasteries, serve as a witness to important transactions, or simply provide comfort to those who were far from home and family. The pilgrims are sharing stories of their journey, but they're also gathering information about the road ahead. Which routes are safe? Which towns are welcoming to pilgrims? Where can they expect to find food and shelter? This information was literally a matter of life and death for medieval travelers. But perhaps the most important function of the tavern was simply providing a place where people could be human together. In a world where most people lived in small, isolated communities, the tavern was often the only place where you could meet someone from beyond your immediate neighborhood. It was where you could hear stories from distant lands, learn about different ways of life, and remember that the world was bigger than your own small corner of it. As the night wears on, the atmosphere in the tavern begins to change. The initial wariness of the patrons gives way to a kind of forced camaraderie. People who were strangers an hour ago are now sharing stories, offering advice, and even sharing food. This isn't necessarily because medieval people were more generous than modern ones. It's because they understood, on a visceral level, that cooperation was essential for survival. The soldier next to you begins to tell stories of his campaigns in France. He's been fighting in what historians will later call the 100 Years' War, and his tales are filled with brutality and horror. But he's also describing the bonds of brotherhood that form between soldiers, the way they looked out for each other, and the strange moments of beauty he found even in the midst of battle. The young woman on your other side gradually reveals her story. She's a refugee from a town that was burned by raiders 3 months ago. She's been walking ever since, hoping to reach a distant relative who might take her in. She has no money, no possessions except the clothes on her back, and no real hope of finding safety. But she's survived this long through a combination of luck, determination, and the occasional kindness of strangers. Her story is heartbreaking, but it's also typical. The medieval world was a place of constant upheaval. Wars, plagues, famines, and natural disasters could destroy entire communities overnight. The people gathered in this tavern tonight are mostly survivors of some catastrophe or another. People who've been forced to leave everything behind and start over. As you listen to these stories, you begin to understand why medieval taverns were so important. They weren't just businesses. They were lifelines for people who had lost everything else. They provided not just food and shelter, but also human connection, information, and hope. In a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, taverns were the threads that held the fabric of society together. But this sense of community comes with a price. The tavern might be a refuge, but it's also a trap. The longer you stay, the more you risk being drawn into the web of relationships and obligations that bind the regular patrons together. The merchant who seems so friendly might be looking for partners in a risky venture. The monk who offers spiritual guidance might expect a substantial donation to his monastery. The soldier who entertains you with his stories might be recruiting for his next campaign. And then there are the darker currents that flow beneath the surface of tavern life. The predators who prey on the vulnerable. The informants who sell information to the highest bidder. The con artists who specialize in cheating travelers out of their money. The tavern keeper who might be in league with bandits, providing information about wealthy patrons who are traveling alone. As the evening progresses, you witness some of these darker aspects firsthand. A young merchant, clearly new to traveling, makes the mistake of openly counting his money. Within minutes, he's been invited to join a dice game by the group of rough-looking men you noticed earlier. The game starts friendly enough, but you can see how it's going to end. The merchant is being slowly but systematically cheated out of his money, and he's too drunk and too inexperienced to realize it. You want to warn him, but you also know that interfering could make you a target. This is one of the harsh realities of medieval tavern life. Sometimes you have to choose between your own safety and doing what's right. The strong prey on the weak, and the smart learn to mind their own business. In another corner, a heated argument is developing between two groups of travelers. It starts as a disagreement about the best route to take to reach the next town, but quickly escalates into something more serious. Accusations are made about theft, about cheating, about cowardice. Hands move to knife handles. The tension in the room ratchets up as other patrons start choosing sides or preparing to get out of the way. The tavern keeper's wife appears with a wooden club in her hands. She doesn't say a word, just stands between the two groups and stares them down. This is her establishment, and she won't tolerate violence that might damage her property or drive away paying customers. The confrontation deflates as quickly as it escalated, but you can see the anger still simmering beneath the surface. This is another crucial aspect of medieval tavern life, the constant potential for violence. In a world where most men carried weapons and disputes were often settled with fists or blades, taverns were powder kegs waiting to explode. The successful tavern keeper was part innkeeper, part diplomat, part bouncer, and part judge. They had to be able to read the mood of their customers, diffuse tensions before they erupted, and when necessary, physically eject troublemakers. But violence wasn't the only danger in medieval taverns. Disease was an even greater threat. In a time before people understood how illness spread, taverns were perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. Dozens of people crowded into small spaces, sharing food, drink, and sleeping quarters. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the constant flow of travelers from distant lands created conditions where diseases could spread rapidly. The Black Death, which killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread primarily along trade routes, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers who stopped at taverns along the way. But taverns were also where people first learned about the approaching plague, where they shared information about which towns were affected and where they made the desperate decision to flee their homes in search of safety. As you sit in the tavern, you can't help but notice the signs of disease among the patrons. The old man who was outside when you arrived is clearly suffering from some kind of respiratory illness, coughing up blood into a rag that he keeps tucked in his sleeve. The young woman next to you has a fever. You can feel the heat radiating from her body. Several people have the telltale buboes of the plague, swollen lymph nodes that mark them as probably doomed. But here's the thing, nobody talks about it. In medieval times, disease was so common, so much a part of daily life, that people simply accepted it as another hardship to be endured. The sick weren't isolated or treated as pariahs. They were just part of the community, for as long as they lived. This acceptance of disease and death gives the medieval tavern a strange, almost surreal quality. People laugh and joke and make plans for the future while literally dying around them. It's not callousness. It's a coping mechanism that developed over centuries of constant exposure to mortality. As the night grows later, the tavern begins to take on a different character. The initial rush of arrival slows, and the focus shifts from drinking and socializing to finding a place to sleep. This is when you discover one of the most challenging aspects of medieval tavern life: the sleeping arrangements. If you're wealthy enough to afford a private room, you're in luck. But private is a relative term. The room will be small, barely large enough for a single bed, and the bed will be shared with whoever else can afford to pay for it. The mattress is nothing more than a sack stuffed with straw, and the blankets are rough wool that hasn't been washed in months. You'll be sharing your bed with strangers, and possibly with fleas, lice, and other vermin. If you can't afford a private room, your options are more limited. You might be able to rent a spot in the common sleeping area, usually a loft above the main room. Here, dozens of people spread out on the floor, using their packs as pillows and their cloaks as blankets. There's no privacy, no security, and no guarantee that you'll wake up with all your possessions. If you can't afford even that, you're relegated to sleeping in the main room of the tavern, either on the floor or on the benches if you're lucky. The fire provides some warmth, but it also fills the room with smoke. The noise never completely stops, as people arrive and depart at all hours, and you're sharing your sleeping space with the tavern's other inhabitants, the dogs, cats, and rats that are as much a part of the establishment as the human patrons. As you contemplate your sleeping arrangements, you observe the nightly ritual of the tavern. The serving staff, usually family members of the tavern keeper, begin cleaning up the worst of the mess. They collect the empty mugs, wipe down the tables, and sweep the worst of the debris from the floor. But this is medieval cleaning, which means the standards are quite different from what you might expect. The rushes on the floor are swept, but not replaced. They're mixed with herbs like rosemary and thyme, which are supposed to mask the odors and repel insects. But the overall effect is still quite overwhelming. The tables are wiped down with rags that have been used for the same purpose for weeks. The mugs are rinsed in a bucket of water that's been used to clean dozens of other mugs and is now more of a soup than water. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval tavern hygiene is the bathroom situation. There isn't one. Not in the modern sense, anyway. If you're lucky, there might be a privy outside, a small shed built over a pit. But more likely, you'll be directed to a corner of the main room where a large pot serves as a communal chamber pot. Privacy is minimal, and the smell is overwhelming. This lack of sanitation created its own set of social rules and customs. People learned to ignore things that would shock modern sensibilities. They developed a tolerance for odors and sights that would send contemporary visitors running for the exit. They understood that survival sometimes meant accepting conditions that were less than ideal. As the night progresses, you begin to notice the subtle hierarchies that govern tavern life. The merchant who can afford his own room is treated with deference by the staff. The monk receives respect because of his religious position. The soldier is given a wide berth because of his reputation for violence. But the young woman refugee next to you is largely ignored, except when someone wants to take advantage of her vulnerability. These hierarchies weren't just about money or social status. They were about survival. In a world where resources were scarce and life was uncertain, people formed alliances and power structures that helped them navigate the constant challenges they faced. The tavern was a microcosm of medieval society, where these relationships were formed, tested, and sometimes broken. As the night grows later, the tavern begins to take on an almost otherworldly quality. The smoke from the fire creates a haze that makes everything seem dreamlike. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows on the walls. The constant murmur of a conversation creates a background hum that's almost hypnotic. But underneath this apparent calm, there's a constant undercurrent of tension. People are listening to conversations they're not part of, looking for information they can use or opportunities they can exploit. The tavern keeper is watching everyone, calculating who might cause trouble and who might be worth cultivating as a regular customer. The predators are still circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. You notice that despite the late hour, new travelers continue to arrive. A group of merchants who've been traveling by night to avoid bandits. A messenger carrying urgent news from the capital. A family who've been walking for days. Their possessions loaded on a single cart, pulled by an ox that looks ready to collapse. Each new arrival brings fresh news, fresh gossip, and fresh opportunities. The merchant might have goods to sell. The messenger might have information about political developments that could affect trade. The family might be wealthy enough to afford good food and wine. But they also bring fresh dangers. The merchant might be a spy. The messenger might be carrying false information. The family might be plague carriers who will infect everyone in the tavern within days. This constant arrival and departure of strangers gives the medieval tavern a unique energy. It's simultaneously a place of refuge and a place of danger, a source of information and a breeding ground for rumors, a community, and a collection of competitors. As the night reaches its deepest point, around what we would now call 3 a.m, the tavern enters its quietest phase. Most of the patrons have found their sleeping arrangements, and the main room is occupied primarily by those who can't afford anything better. The fire has burned down to glowing coals, and the smoke has cleared somewhat. This is when the tavern reveals its most intimate secrets. In the dim light, you can see the true desperation of many of the patrons. The young woman next to you is crying silently, probably thinking about the home and family she's lost. The old soldier is muttering in his sleep, reliving battles from years past. The merchant is counting and recounting his money, trying to figure out how to make it last until he reaches his destination. But you also see moments of surprising tenderness. A mother comforting her sick child, 2 strangers sharing a blanket, an old woman helping a young man bandage a wound. These small acts of kindness given freely despite the harsh circumstances, remind you that even in the darkest times, human compassion survives. As you try to find a comfortable position on the hard wooden bench, you reflect on what you've witnessed tonight. The medieval tavern is nothing like the romanticized version you might have imagined. It's dirty, dangerous, and often desperate. But it's also essential. It's a place where people who have nothing left can find something. Whether it's a meal, a place to sleep, information about the road ahead, or simply the comfort of human company. The tavern is a mirror of medieval society itself, brutal and beautiful, harsh and hospitable, terrifying and comforting, often simultaneously. It's a place where the best and worst of human nature are on constant display, where survival depends on a complex web of relationships and obligations, and where the line between civilization and chaos is constantly being negotiated. As dawn approaches, the tavern begins to stir again. The early risers start preparing for departure, gathering their belongings and settling their accounts with the tavern keeper. The fire is stoked back to life, and the smell of cooking food begins to compete with the other odors that permeate the building. You realize that you've spent the night in one of the most important institutions of medieval society. The tavern wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline, a communication network, a social center, and a refuge all rolled into one. It was where the mobile elements of society, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, refugees, connected with the stable elements, local farmers, craftsmen, and clergy. The tavern was also where the formal structures of medieval society, the feudal system, the church, the guild system intersected with the informal networks of relationships and obligations that actually made daily life possible. It was where news traveled, where business was conducted, where alliances were formed, and where the complex web of medieval society was woven together. But perhaps most importantly, the tavern was where people learned to be human in inhuman circumstances. It was where they developed the survival skills, the social networks, and the emotional resilience that allowed them to navigate a world that was constantly trying to kill them. The economic realities of running a medieval tavern were brutal. The tavern keeper had to purchase grain for brewing, food for cooking, fuel for heating, and supplies for maintenance. They had to pay taxes to local lords, fees to guilds, and bribes to officials. They had to absorb the losses when customers couldn't pay, when goods spoiled, when violence damaged property. They operated on thin margins in an economy where crop failures, wars, and plagues could destroy their customer base overnight. But they also occupied a unique position in medieval society. The tavern keeper was often one of the wealthiest people in a small town, able to accumulate capital through their business dealings with travelers. They were also among the best informed, constantly receiving news and information from their customers. This combination of wealth and information made them powerful figures in their communities, often serving as informal bankers, advisors, and mediators. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life profoundly affected tavern operations. Summer brought the peak traveling season, when roads were passable and weather was favorable. Winter was a different story entirely. Travel became dangerous or impossible, and the customer base shifted to local residents and the occasional desperate traveler caught by bad weather. Taverns had to stockpile supplies to last through the lean months, while also providing extended hospitality to travelers who might be stranded for weeks or months. The relationship between taverns and religious authorities was complex and often tense. The church recognized the necessity of hospitality, but was deeply suspicious of the tavern's role as a center of secular culture. The combination of alcohol, gambling, music, and mixed company created conditions that church authorities saw as conducive to sin and moral corruption. Many taverns tried to maintain respectability by refusing to serve alcohol on certain religious holidays, by providing space for religious services, or by making charitable donations to local churches. Some tavern keepers found ways to work with religious authorities, providing free lodging for traveling monks, or offering their establishments as meeting places for religious gatherings. The legal status of taverns was equally complex. Operating a tavern required some form of license from local authorities, which came with both obligations and privileges. The tavern keeper often served as an unofficial representative of local government, collecting information about travelers, enforcing certain laws, and serving as a point of contact between authorities and the transient population. The cultural impact of taverns extended far beyond their immediate economic and social functions. Taverns were where stories were told, songs were sung, and traditions were passed down. They were where traveling performers found audiences, where local musicians learned new songs, and where the folk culture of medieval Europe was created and preserved. Many of the stories, songs, and legends that we associate with medieval culture originated in taverns. The tales of Robin Hood, the Arthurian legends, the various saints' lives and miracle stories. All of these were shaped and preserved by the oral tradition that centered on tavern life. The tavern was where news became narrative, where the dry facts of political events were transformed into the stories that gave them meaning and context. These narratives shaped how people understood their world and their place in it. The stories told in taverns became the lens through which ordinary people interpreted the major events of their time. The tavern was where the official version of events met the popular understanding, where propaganda was tested against experience, and where the real meaning of historical events was negotiated. The artistic traditions that developed around tavern culture were remarkably sophisticated. The songs that were sung in taverns weren't just simple drinking songs. They were complex narrative compositions that preserved historical events, moral teachings, and cultural values. The stories that were told weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated explorations of human nature, social relationships, and ethical dilemmas. The visual arts were also influenced by tavern culture. Many of the illuminated manuscripts, woodcuts, and other artistic works of the medieval period depict tavern scenes or draw inspiration from tavern life. These artistic representations both reflected and shaped popular understanding of what taverns were and what they meant. The intellectual life of medieval Europe was profoundly influenced by tavern culture. Many universities were located in towns with thriving tavern districts, and the informal discussions that took place in taverns often paralleled and influenced the formal academic debates that took place in universities. Students, professors, and visiting scholars all participated in tavern culture, bringing academic ideas into contact with popular wisdom and practical experience. Some of the most important intellectual developments of the medieval period in philosophy, theology, natural science, and political theory were influenced by the cross-cultural exchanges that took place in taverns. The diversity of perspectives that came together in these establishments created opportunities for intellectual synthesis that weren't available in more formal academic settings. The technological innovations that improved tavern operations often had broader applications. Better brewing techniques led to advances in chemistry and fermentation science. Improved food preservation methods contributed to developments in agriculture and nutrition. More efficient heating and lighting systems influenced architecture and engineering. The organizational innovations developed by successful tavern keepers, systems for managing credit, inventory, and customer relationships, often served as models for other types of businesses. The tavern was in many ways a laboratory for developing the commercial practices that would eventually evolve into modern business methods. The economic networks that centered on taverns were incredibly complex and far-reaching. A single tavern might be connected to dozens of suppliers, hundreds of customers, and thousands of indirect business relationships. The tavern keeper had to manage credit arrangements with customers who might not return for months or years. They had to maintain relationships with suppliers who might be hundreds of miles away. They had to navigate currency systems that varied from region to region and were constantly changing. Many taverns served as informal banks, holding money and valuables for traveling customers, providing letters of credit that could be honored at other establishments, and facilitating complex financial transactions between merchants from different regions. The trust required for these arrangements was enormous, and the reputation for honest dealing was literally worth more than gold. The information networks that flowed through taverns were equally valuable. News, rumors, gossip, and intelligence moved through the tavern system faster than through any official channels. A savvy tavern keeper could profit enormously by trading in information, warning friendly merchants about bandit activity, providing intelligence to military commanders, or selling commercial information to competitors. But information was also dangerous. The wrong word to the wrong person could destroy relationships, start wars, or bring down governments. Tavern keepers had to develop sophisticated skills in managing information, knowing what to share, what to keep secret, and what to forget they ever heard. The linguistic challenges faced by tavern keepers were immense. A single tavern might serve customers who spoke Latin, French, English, German, and various local dialects. The tavern keeper and staff had to develop at least basic communication skills in multiple languages, or employ translators who could facilitate business dealings. Religious differences were equally challenging. Medieval Europe was officially Christian, but the reality was much more complex. Different regions followed different Christian traditions, and there were significant populations of Jews, Muslims, and adherents of various folk religions. The tavern had to provide hospitality to all while avoiding religious conflicts that could escalate into violence. Political differences were perhaps the most dangerous. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and other political entities that were often at war with each other. A tavern might serve soldiers from opposing armies, spies from rival kingdoms, and merchants whose business dealings crossed multiple political boundaries. The tavern keeper had to maintain strict neutrality while gathering the information necessary to protect their establishment and their customers. Some taverns developed specializations that set them apart from their competitors. A tavern near a major cathedral might cater specifically to pilgrims, offering special services like letter writing, confession, and religious souvenirs. A tavern on a major trade route might specialize in serving merchants, offering secure storage for valuable goods and connections to local suppliers. Taverns near universities often served as informal extensions of the academic community, providing spaces where scholars could meet, debate, and exchange ideas. Some taverns even became known as centers of learning in their own right, places where traveling scholars would stop to share their knowledge with local students. But perhaps the most important specialization was geographical. Taverns served as informal embassies for their regions, places where travelers could learn about local customs, laws, and opportunities. The tavern keeper often served as an unofficial ambassador, helping to smooth relationships between locals and outsiders. This role as cultural mediator was especially important in border regions, where different peoples, languages, and customs came together. A tavern on the border between England and Scotland, for example, might serve customers who spoke different languages, followed different laws, and considered each other enemies. The tavern keeper had to create a neutral space where these differences could be temporarily set aside in the interest of business and survival. Many tavern keepers developed reputations that extended far beyond their immediate localities. A tavern known for honest dealing, good food, and safe lodging could attract customers from hundreds of miles away. Merchants would plan their routes around known good taverns, and word-of-mouth recommendations could make or break a tavern's business. But the reputation could also work against them. A tavern known for cheating customers, serving bad food, or harboring criminals could find itself boycotted by honest travelers and targeted by authorities. The line between a respectable establishment and a criminal enterprise was often thin, and tavern keepers had to navigate it carefully. As you continue your journey away from the tavern, carrying these memories and insights with you, you begin to understand that what you experienced wasn't just a night's lodging. It was an immersion in one of the most important institutions of medieval civilization. The tavern was more than just a business, more than just a social center, more than just a refuge for travelers. It was a microcosm of medieval society, a place where all the forces that shaped medieval life came together and worked themselves out on a human scale. The tavern was where the grand narratives of medieval history, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the spread of religions, the development of trade networks, the evolution of technology, intersected with the personal narratives of individual lives. It was where abstract concepts like hospitality, community, survival, and hope took on concrete meaning through daily practice. Behind the scenes of every tavern was a complex operation run by people who dedicated their entire lives to serving others. The tavern keeper's family didn't just work in the hospitality industry. They were the hospitality industry, personally responsible for maintaining one of the threads that held society together. Their children grew up learning that hospitality wasn't just a profession, it was a calling, a sacred duty to provide refuge for the wanderer, sustenance for the hungry, and hope for the desperate. The morning routine that you witness as you prepare to leave reveals the relentless nature of tavern life. The tavern keeper's wife is already sweeping the rushes, wiping down the tables, checking the ale barrels. She's done this same routine thousands of times before, and she'll do it thousands of times again. The tavern keeper himself is checking on the next batch of ale, knowing the secret recipes passed down through generations, understanding his role as keeper of one of society's most important institutions. The successful tavern keeper needed to be part entrepreneur, part diplomat, part judge, and part protector. They had to be able to read people quickly, assess risks accurately, and make split-second decisions about who to trust and who to avoid. They had to maintain relationships with local authorities, traveling merchants, religious figures, and criminal elements. They had to balance the competing demands of profitability and hospitality, safety and openness, law and necessity. The legal complexities were compounded by the fact that medieval law varied dramatically from place to place. A tavern keeper had to understand not only local laws and customs, but also the legal traditions of the various regions from which their customers came. Contract disputes, criminal accusations, and civil disagreements all had to be handled according to different legal frameworks depending on the parties involved. Many taverns developed their own informal legal systems, with the tavern keeper serving as judge and jury in minor disputes. These decisions were often based more on practical considerations than on formal legal principles. What would keep the peace? What would protect the tavern's reputation? What would ensure that everyone could continue doing business together? The religious seasons also shaped tavern life in profound ways. The period before major religious holidays like Easter and Christmas saw increased pilgrim traffic as people traveled to religious sites. But these same periods also brought increased scrutiny from religious authorities, who were often suspicious of the tavern's role in society. Some tavern keepers found ways to work with religious authorities rather than against them. They might provide free lodging for traveling monks, offer their establishments as meeting places for religious gatherings, or sponsor religious festivals and celebrations. These relationships could provide protection against religious criticism, while also attracting customers who value the tavern's connection to the church. The winter months brought their own unique challenges and rhythms. When travel became dangerous or impossible, the customer base shifted dramatically to local residents and the occasional desperate traveler caught by bad weather. Taverns had to stockpile supplies to last through the lean months, while also providing extended hospitality to travelers who might be stranded for weeks or months. During these long winter nights, the tavern took on a different character entirely. The focus shifted from the constant flow of travelers to the deeper relationships with local customers. This was when the tavern truly became the heart of the community, where local families would gather to share news, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and simply survive the isolation and hardship of the dark months. The spring planting season and autumn harvest affected tavern business in complex ways. Local farmers had less time and money to spend in taverns during these crucial periods. But the movement of grain and other agricultural products created opportunities to serve traveling merchants and traders. The successful tavern keeper learned to adapt their business model to these seasonal rhythms, perhaps focusing more on storage and logistics during harvest time, or offering special services to support the agricultural community. Most importantly, the tavern was where people learned to be human in inhuman circumstances. It was where they developed the survival skills, the social networks, and the emotional resilience that allowed them to navigate a world that was constantly trying to kill them. The lessons learned in medieval taverns about cooperation, about reading people, about managing resources, about maintaining hope in desperate circumstances, were literally matters of life and death. But you also carry with you a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world where humanity is constantly under threat. You've seen how people can maintain their dignity and compassion even in the most desperate circumstances. You've witnessed the power of small acts of kindness to provide hope in the darkest times. As you step back out into the cold morning air, you understand that you've experienced something that was simultaneously unique to the medieval world and universal to the human experience. The specific details of medieval tavern life belong to a particular time and place, but the underlying human needs that the tavern served, for shelter, for food, for information, for community, for hope, are timeless. The medieval tavern was a response to the specific challenges of medieval life, but it was also a reflection of the eternal human need for places where we can come together, share our stories, and remember that we're not alone in our struggles. The tavern was not just a medieval institution, it was a fundamentally human institution, as relevant today as it was 700 years ago. The story of what really happened inside medieval taverns is ultimately the story of what it means to be human. Flawed, struggling, often desperate, but still capable of kindness, still willing to help each other, still able to find joy and meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. It's a story that reminds us that no matter how dark the times may seem, there are always people working to keep the fires burning, to keep the doors open, and to keep the human spirit alive. So, the next time you find yourself in a place that offers food, drink, and shelter to strangers, whether it's a modern hotel, a roadside diner, or even your own home when you welcome unexpected guests, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most essential traditions. You're carrying forward the legacy of countless medieval tavern keepers who understood that hospitality isn't just a business, it's a sacred duty. You're honoring the memory of millions of travelers who found refuge, comfort, and hope in these humble establishments during some of history's darkest periods. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit lives on in every act of welcome, every gesture of kindness to strangers, every moment when we choose to open our doors rather than close them, to extend our hands rather than turn away. In preserving this tradition of hospitality, we preserve something essential about what it means to be human. And perhaps, on quiet nights, when the wind howls outside and strangers seek shelter from the storm, we can still hear the echo of those ancient taverns, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of conversation, the clink of clay mugs, and the timeless sound of people caring for each other in a world that often seems determined to keep us apart. The tavern doors may have closed centuries ago, but the human heart that opened them remains forever open, forever welcoming, forever ready to offer sanctuary to any weary traveler who needs a place to rest, a warm meal, and the simple comfort of knowing they are not alone. If you enjoyed this journey into medieval history and found it helpful for relaxation or sleep, a gentle light helps other people discover these stories too. And if you'd like more boring history to drift off to, consider subscribing for new episodes, exploring the hidden truths of the past. Sweet dreams. And thank you for letting us share these ancient stories with you tonight.